The first kid hit the cow manure at 12 miles an hour, and that was the exact moment the HOA realized my pasture was never a park. I was standing at my south fence line with a pair of leather gloves still in my back pocket when I heard the scream of bicycle brakes cutting across the morning air. It came sharp and sudden, followed by the wet skid of tires on something that had no business being on a bike trail but every business being in a working pasture. Then came the smell. Hot asphalt. Fresh cut cedar posts. Crushed grass. And underneath it all, the heavy, unmistakable scent of cattle and damp earth warming under a Texas sun that had barely cleared the horizon. I didn't have to walk another 10 feet to know what they'd done. The HOA had poured a bike path straight through my grazing field. It ran in a smooth black ribbon from the back edge of Willow Creek Estates, curved right past my stock pond, then cut across the lane my herd used every morning to move toward the North Trough. Bright white paint still gleamed on the edges. There were little reflective markers every 20 yards, cheerful as Christmas lights, and a brand new sign planted crooked in the dirt that read Willow Creek Family Wellness Trail, as if slapping a pleasant name on theft made it legal. 50 yards away, a boy around 10 was trying to stand up while his mother fussed over his handlebars, her sneakers already streaked with manure. Beyond them, one of my Angus cows lifted her head from the mineral block and stared at the whole scene with slow, patient confusion. That was the part that almost made me laugh. Not because any of it was funny, but because the absurdity hit all at once. These people had looked at active cattle land, with fencing, trough lines, hoof prints, feed bins, warning placards, and 2,000 pounds of moving livestock, and somehow decided what it really needed was joggers and kids on mountain bikes. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and my family has worked this land outside Austin for 3 generations. My grandfather bought the first 100 acres when this county was more mesquite than subdivisions. My dad added fencing, irrigation, and enough sweat equity to build something real. Me, I run cattle. Not as a hobby. Not for appearances. This pasture feeds my herd, pays my bills, and carries more of my family's history than any framed photograph ever could. Every gate has a reason. Every stretch of grass has a rotation. Every rut in the dirt means something to somebody who knows how to read land. Margaret Whitmore did not know how to read land. Margaret knew glossy mailers, ribbon cuttings, staged HOA photos, and the kind of smile that always looked like it had a legal threat hiding behind it. 3 months earlier she'd stood at the property line in a white tennis visor, staring through my fence like she was already redesigning it in her head. She called my pasture wasted visual space. I remember that phrase because it landed wrong the second it left her mouth. Wasted visual space. That's how people talk when they've never had to make a living from dirt. That morning, as I looked at the trail they'd carved through my field, the last of the paving crew was packing up. A roller still ticked as it cooled. Orange survey paint marked the grass like a rash. One section of my fence had been cut and wired back loose, lazy and temporary, just enough for contractors to slip through. My cattle lane was blocked by decorative posts with little solar caps on top. They had literally landscaped over my operation. And then Margaret came walking down that new path in crisp white sneakers, smiling like she'd opened Disneyland. She spread her arms wide and said, "Isn't this just so much better for the community?" I looked past her at the blacktop, the bent fence wire, the churned mud by the trough, and the kid still wiping manure off one tire. Then I looked back at her and understood something cold and simple. She thought she'd built a trail through empty land. What she had really built was evidence. My father used to say a pasture tells the truth faster than people do. Stand in it long enough, and you can see what is working, what is failing, and who has no business making decisions about land they do not understand. That morning, with the new blacktop still giving off heat and chemical smell under the sun, I kept hearing his voice in my head. Because everything about that field was telling the truth, and none of it matched the polished little fantasy Margaret Whitmore had sold to her neighborhood. That pasture was not open space. It was not decorative land. It was not a blank patch of green waiting for an HOA improvement project. It was part of a living operation that started before most of Willow Creek Estates even existed on paper. My grandfather, Walter Caldwell, bought the original acreage in 1958 with money he earned hauling feed and fixing fences for other ranchers. He did not leave me stocks or lake houses or anything that looked impressive in a bank brochure. He left me soil, water rights, line maps, and a reputation that still meant something at the sale barn. My father added the north fencing, rebuilt the stock pond berm after a hard spring flood in 1994, and kept handwritten grazing logs in a metal filing cabinet that still sits in my office smelling like dust, ink, and old paper. I grew up with those records. I learned to read ear tags before I learned long division. I learned that if a gate was open, there was a reason. If a section was rested, there was a reason. If cattle moved one direction in the morning and another at sundown, there was a reason. That is how working land operates. Nothing is random. The pasture Margaret turned into her little bike trail covered just under 32 acres on the south side of my property. We used it as an active rotation field for my Black Angus herd, especially in late spring when the grass came in thick and the shade along the live oaks kept the animals calmer through the hotter part of the day. The trail they poured cut across the exact corridor I used to move cattle from the south gate to the north watering trough. It also ran too close to a mineral station, crossed within sightline of the stock pond embankment, and passed right through a section clearly marked with metal signs that said active livestock area and no public access. Those signs were not hidden. They were bolted chest-high to cedar posts and sun-faded from years of doing their job. Somebody had pulled one up and tossed it into the grass like it was yard clutter. That got under my skin more than the asphalt did. You can replace fence wire. You can haul off gravel. You can reseed torn-up ground. But there is something about seeing a warning sign from your own land thrown face down in the dirt that tells you exactly how little respect the other side has for what you built. By the time I was 35, this ranch was not some inheritance I coasted on. It was payroll, vet bills, diesel, hay contracts, market timing, drought math, and early mornings cold enough to sting your teeth. I had 14 brood cows in that south section, one breeding bull I watched like a hawk, and 2 spring calves still young enough to spook when strangers got too close to the fence. I sold beef through a processor up near Georgetown, leased winter hay acreage from a cousin west of town, and kept my books straight enough that the county still recognized the parcel under agricultural valuation. Which meant the land was documented, taxed, insured, and actively used for cattle. Not someday. Not years ago. Right then. That is what made Margaret's little project so stupid. She had not built through abandoned land. She had built straight through a schedule, a business, and a legal paper trail older than her subdivision clubhouse. And the more I stood there smelling tar mixed with manure and fresh-cut grass, the more I realized this was not just arrogance. It was ignorance with a budget. Margaret Whitmore had the kind of confidence that only comes from spending too many years being obeyed by people who would rather keep the peace than tell her no. She was in her early 50s, always pressed and polished, always dressed like she might be photographed for a community newsletter at any moment. White visor. White sneakers. White golf cart. Even her smile looked color-coordinated, neat and expensive and practiced enough to survive any amount of hypocrisy. She did not walk through Willow Creek Estate so much as patrol it. Every lawn edge, every mailbox post, every trash can left out 10 minutes too long seemed to exist for her personal review. I had known her type my whole life. Every county has one. Somebody who confuses procedure with wisdom and thinks a stack of printed rules gives them authority over things they do not own, do not understand, and absolutely should not touch. The first time Margaret came to my fence line, it was late March, warm wind moving through the grass, cedar pollen floating gold. In the light. I was leaning over the latch on the south gate, checking a hinge that had started to sag, when I heard the hum of an electric cart rolling up behind me. She stepped out carrying a stainless steel tumbler and wearing that tight little smile like we were about to have a civilized conversation between equals. She did not ask what the land was used for. She did not ask whether the cattle rotated through that section. She did not ask whether there were easements, water lines, insurance restrictions, or liability issues. She just looked through the fence, took in the field like a woman judging drapes, and said, "It is such a shame this beautiful stretch is not doing more for the neighborhood." I remember the click of the gate chain in my hand when she said that. Such a small sound, but sharp enough that I still hear it clear. I asked her what exactly she meant by more. She gestured toward the pasture with 2 fingers like she was unveiling a model home. She talked about connectivity, family wellness, shared outdoor experience, and increasing property value through thoughtful access features. Margaret loved phrases that sounded harmless until you translated them into plain English. Shared outdoor experience meant she wanted access to my land. Connectivity meant she wanted a route through it. Thoughtful access features meant signs, pavement, posts, and strangers acting like they belonged there. I told her the same thing I would tell any person with common sense. It was active cattle land. Private property. No access. She blinked once, nodded slowly, then gave me the same smile people use when they have already decided your answer is temporary. After that, she started showing up in smaller ways. A servo ribbon tied to brush near my west line. Footprints by the fence after dusk. A couple from the subdivision pausing with coffee cups in hand to stare through the cedar posts like they were scouting a nature preserve. Then one Saturday morning I caught Margaret standing beside the back fence with 2 board members and a man in khakis carrying rolled-up plans under his arm. I could smell her perfume from 20 feet away, sweet and powdery and completely out of place over manure and sunbaked dirt. She introduced the man as a landscape consultant. Not an engineer. Not a ranch manager. Not a county official. A landscape consultant. I asked them what they were doing on my fence line, and Margaret answered like I was interrupting her generosity. Just exploring possibilities. That phrase sat wrong with me for days. Exploring possibilities is what people say when they want room to deny what they are already trying to do. I told them there were no possibilities. The fence stayed. The cattle stayed. The answer stayed no. Margaret's face did not crack, but her eyes cooled a few degrees. She thanked me in that brittle voice people use when they are already planning to go around you. From then on, every notice board in Willow Creek Estate seemed to sprout language about community expansion, outdoor amenities, and future trail integration. Neighbors who had barely looked my way before started acting like my pasture was some stubborn obstacle standing between them and paradise. Margaret had done what people like her always do. She turned a boundary into a public relations problem, and she turned my refusal into the reason her little kingdom could not grow. The invasion started quietly, which is how people like Margaret prefer to operate when they know they would lose in an honest conversation. No announcement at my gate. No certified letter on my porch. No county truck, no deputy, no one with actual authority. Just little signs at first, the kind that make you question your own eyes before your temper catches up. A streak of orange paint on a cedar post near the west fence. Then another one 2 days later closer to the south line. I found a wood stake hammered into the grass about 10 feet inside my property, topped with pink ribbon that snapped in the wind above a patch my heifers had grazed down the week before. I pulled it out, tossed it in the bed of my truck, and told myself maybe some contractor had wandered too far. By the end of that week, I knew better. The morning it became real, I woke up before sunrise to the low rumble of diesel coming across the field. Not highway diesel. Heavy equipment diesel. Thick, mechanical, steady enough to vibrate through the kitchen window over my sink. I set down my coffee, still black and too hot to drink, and stepped onto the porch in boots and yesterday's jeans. The air smelled wrong. Dust, exhaust. And that bitter chemical edge that comes before paving work. I drove the ranch truck down the Caliche Lane with my headlights cutting through the early grey, and by the time I reached the south section, they were already inside my fence. A skid steer sat idling beside the stock lane. 2 labours in reflective vests were rolling wire back from the opening they had cut. A compact track loader had chewed twin paths through the grass. Survey flags lined a curve through the field like someone had sketched over my life with neon crayons. I got out so fast I left the driver door hanging open. The foreman was standing near a flatbed trailer holding a clipboard and a rolled site plan. Mid-40s maybe, sunburned neck, expression of a man who had done enough questionable jobs to stop asking questions. I asked him who authorized this. He glanced at the paper, then at me, then gave the answer I have heard too many times in too many forms. We were told this was approved access work for Willow Creek. Approved by who? I asked. He pointed with his pen toward the subdivision fence line, and there she was, Margaret Whitmore, standing in the grass in spotless white sneakers like this was some kind of ceremonial groundbreaking. Even from a distance I could see that satisfied set to her shoulders. She had brought coffee for 2 board members. One of them was taking pictures on a phone. Margaret walked toward me with the kind of calm that only comes from thinking the hard part is already over. She said they were improving a planned community corridor and that I had been too difficult about prior discussions. Difficult. That was her word for refusing to let strangers pave through a working cattle route. I told her to shut the job down and get every machine off my land. She tilted her head and said the county records reflected a pending access alignment beneficial to the surrounding development. Pending. Not recorded. Not granted. Not signed by me. But she said it with such polished confidence you could almost hear the years of people backing down in front of her. I remember the sound of metal clanking as one worker dropped a section of cut fence beside my water line marker. I remember a calf bawling from the far side of the pasture because the machine noise had scattered part of the herd. I remember the smell of torn grass under fresh tire tread and the way the stock lane already looked wounded, dark tracks pressed into earth my father had kept clean for 20 years. By noon they had laid gravel base across the first 100 yards, and by late afternoon the shape of the trail was visible from my porch like a scar I had not agreed to carry. Margaret did not just cross a line that day. She bet everything on the idea that once the damage looked official enough, nobody would bother undoing it. By the next morning, Margaret had moved from trespass to theatre. That is the thing about people who know they are wrong. They rarely stop. They just start narrating the story in a way that makes them sound noble. I found the first version of her story on the neighborhood message board website, posted under the cheerful banner of Community Progress Update. According to Margaret, the new trail was a long-planned amenity designed to improve safety, encourage healthy outdoor activity, and connect families to nature. Nature. She wrote that word while standing 50 feet from a mineral feeder and a posted livestock warning sign. Then came the part that made my jaw tighten hard enough to ache. She claimed I had become unexpectedly hostile toward a project intended to benefit local children and accused me of creating an unsafe atmosphere by continuing normal ranch operations near the path. In other words, she had bulldozed into my pasture and somehow decided I was the one endangering people by still running cattle on cattle land. By noon, her version had spread through Willow Creek estates like perfume through a church foyer. I started getting looks at the feed store from 2 newer residents who had moved out from the subdivision. One of them asked if I had really refused to cooperate on a shared access solution. Shared access. Another fake phrase polished up to hide the truth. That afternoon, I found 2 more signs posted along the new trail route, both planted on my property without permission. One read, "Please respect community space." The other said, "Caution, livestock may be present," like the cattle were temporary guests in a place that suddenly belonged to everybody else. I stood there in the heat with the paper edges fluttering against plastic stakes, reading those words over and over while cicadas screamed from the trees. Community space. My father's fence. My grandfather's soil. My tax bill. My insurance policy. My herd. But now, if you listen to Margaret long enough, somehow I was the difficult man refusing to share. The certified letter arrived the next day. Thick cream envelope. HOA letterhead. Expensive paper that smelled faintly of printer toner and bad intentions. Margaret had formally notified me that the association considered the corridor a community improvement area serving the broader development and that I was expected to refrain from interfering with peaceful public enjoyment. Peaceful public enjoyment of my pasture. She also warned that any attempt to obstruct the trail, move the signs, or restrict access could expose me to civil liability if residents were inconvenienced or injured. I had to read that sentence twice just to let the stupidity settle properly. They cut my fence, ran paving equipment through active livestock lanes, ignored private property signs, then threatened me over inconvenience. I called the county office that same afternoon. I got transferred 3 times, listened to tinny hold music, and finally reached a planning staffer who sounded tired before I even finished my first sentence. He pulled up a file, clicked around for a minute, and told me there appeared to be a conceptual trail linkage shown on a development exhibit connected to Willow Creek Estate's expansion discussions. Conceptual. Not approved. Not recorded. Not binding. But by the way he said it, I could already hear the shrug in the system. Something had been floated. Margaret had treated it like permission. And now everyone downstream of that paperwork mess wanted somebody else to deal with it. I called a local attorney in town, a man whose billboard promised aggressive property defense and real Texas results. He met me in an office that smelled like leather chairs and stale air conditioning, flipped through the photos on my phone, and nodded a lot without saying anything useful for the first 10 minutes. Then he told me we could challenge the matter, seek injunctive relief, examine easement questions, review development filings, and pursue damages if warranted. All true, technically. Then he slid a retainer agreement across the desk so high it made my stomach drop harder than the price of feeder calves in a dry year. On the drive home, dust trailing behind my truck on the Caliche lane, I realized what Margaret was counting on. Not just that she could get away with it, but that pushing back the right way would cost enough time, money, and patience to wear me down before the law ever caught up. She was not relying on being right. She was relying on momentum. That night I did not turn on the television, did not return calls, did not waste another minute imagining Margaret would suddenly grow a conscience. I went straight to the old ranch office behind my house, the one my father used as both paperwork room and weather shelter, and unlocked the grey metal filing cabinet that still stuck on the bottom drawer every humid summer. The room smelled like dust, coffee grounds, saddle soap, and old paper that had been handled by men who trusted records more than promises. I pulled the chain on the overhead light, listened to it buzz alive, and started digging. If Margaret wanted to play games with development exhibits and polished phrases, then I needed the kind of truth that comes with dates, signatures, parcel numbers, and county stamps. My father kept everything. That used to embarrass me when I was younger. He saved feed invoices, fence repair receipts, water meter logs, veterinary calls, tax appraisals, and handwritten notes clipped to survey maps with rusted paper clips. But somewhere around midnight, with folders spread across the desk and the smell of old ink rising off the pages, I stopped seeing clutter and started seeing ammunition. First came the deed packet. Caldwell Family Holdings, South Pasture Tract, legal description intact, boundaries clear, no recorded access grant, no utility easement for pedestrian use, no public dedication language of any kind. Then came the county agricultural valuation file, renewed year after year without interruption, backed by cattle inventory reports and grazing use documentation that proved the land was not ornamental, not idle, and not available for any suburban rebranding Margaret wanted to slap on it. I found insurance riders next, the ones my agent had insisted on because livestock operations carry their own set of risks and responsibilities. Every page used the same kind of plain language I trust. Active cattle operation. Restricted non-owner access. Fence integrity required. Public recreational use excluded unless specifically approved in writing. I leaned back in the chair and let that sink in. Margaret had not just ignored a fence. She had paved straight through a liability boundary. Around 1 a.m. I opened the bottom drawer and found my father's old grazing binders, each one labeled in black marker by year. The plastic covers were cracked, the corners soft from years of use, but inside was pure order. Rotation schedules. Stock counts. Rainfall notes. Pasture rest periods. Mineral placement logs. Trough maintenance. There, in my father's square block handwriting, was the south lane marked as a primary movement corridor for cattle between the low gate and the north water station. The exact route the new trail crossed. I could almost hear him muttering while he wrote it, pencil tapping the page, boots still muddy from the field. Every detail Margaret had treated like scenery was sitting in black and white, documented long before her neighborhood even had a decorative entrance sign. Then I found the map that made me stop breathing for half a second. Rolled tight in a cardboard tube behind the cabinet was a certified survey from 2006, done when my father refinanced part of the operation after a bad drought year. I spread it across the desk and pinned the corners down with a stapler, a coffee mug, and an old branding iron handle. Clean lines. Bearings. Measurements. Fence alignments. Gate locations. The south pasture was drawn with a precision no one could argue with, and there was no corridor, no access strip, no reserved path anywhere near the section Margaret had paved. More than that, the survey showed the Willow Creek Estate's boundary ending exactly where my fence began. Not approximately. Not conceptually. Exactly. By 2 in the morning I had a stack of copies, photos on my phone, and a legal pad filled with notes. But the final piece came from a dusty accordion file labeled county tax. Buried behind valuation notices and extension forms was a letter from the appraisal district confirming continued agricultural use based on active livestock production on the South Tract. It was dated only 11 months earlier. Not old history. Not family legend. Current. Official. Alive. I sat there listening to the ceiling fan click on every rotation and realized the shape of Margaret's mistake at full size. She had built her little trail on land that was documented 6 different ways as an active agricultural parcel. Deed records. Tax records. Insurance records. Survey records. Grazing logs. Operational maps. She had not stumbled into grey area. She had marched in broad daylight past every possible warning and poured asphalt anyway. And for the first time since I heard those machines on my land, the anger in my chest settled into something colder and far more useful. I was done reacting. Now I knew exactly where the ground was solid. The next morning I did something Margaret would never have expected, and that was nothing. At least nothing she could see. I did not chain off the trail. I did not pull the signs. I did not park my truck across the opening and start a shouting match for the benefit of her neighborhood audience. People like Margaret are always ready for anger because anger gives them something to point at. It turns the person they wronged into the story instead of the wrong itself. So I left the blacktop right where she put it, cutting across my pasture like a bad idea poured in asphalt, and I started building a record so clean even a lazy county office could not ignore it. The first thing I did was call my insurance agent, Dale Hensley, a man who had known my family long enough to remember when my father still carried maps folded in the glove box instead of on a phone. Dale came out that afternoon in a faded blue pickup with an inspection tablet under one arm and a straw hat crushed so flat it looked like it had survived 3 droughts and a divorce. He stood at the edge of the trail, looked at the fence opening, the stock lane, the warning signs, and the hoof churn near the water route, then let out one low whistle. That was all he needed to say at first. He walked the corridor with me, took pictures of every sign, every cut wire, every place the path crossed active livestock movement, and every section where the HOA had created access through land specifically listed as restricted in my policy. He said the same thing I had already started to understand in my bones. This was not just trespass anymore. This was exposure. Real exposure. The kind that makes underwriters nervous and lawyers attentive. After Dale left, I called a different attorney, not the billboard one in town with polished boots and an expensive handshake. I called a woman in Georgetown named Laura Bennett, recommended by a cattle broker who once told me she had the rare gift of sounding calm while making other people regret paperwork. Laura did not waste 10 minutes nodding. She asked for the survey, the deed packet, the agricultural valuation, the insurance rider, photographs of the construction, and a timeline with dates and names. I emailed everything before sundown while the smell of cut grass still drifted in through the office screen. By evening she called back and said the words I had been waiting to hear. Do not touch the trail yet. That is when I knew I had found the right lawyer. Because she saw what I saw. Margaret had created a trap, but she had stepped in it first. Over the next 3 days, I turned my pasture into evidence. I mounted 2 trail cameras high in the live oaks where they could watch the blacktop without being obvious. I pulled footage from the security camera over my equipment shed that caught the paving crew cutting my fence and rolling machinery through the south gate. I photographed bicycle tire tracks crossing through fresh manure, joggers pausing to read signs that clearly warned of active livestock, and parents pushing strollers past my mineral station like they were on a winery path. Every picture told the same story. Margaret had not made the land safer, cleaner, or more usable. She had taken a functioning cattle corridor and introduced public traffic into it without permission, without proper authority, and without even the common sense to ask what might go wrong. The final piece came from Margaret herself because vanity makes careless people generous. Willow Creek Estates announced a grand opening for the trail on Saturday morning with ribbon, refreshments, and a family ride. Margaret posted smiling updates online all week, bragging about community vision and modern outdoor living. I screenshotted every word. Then I stood at my fence line Friday evening with the sun going copper over the pasture and realized the whole thing had shifted. I was not trying to stop her dream anymore. I was waiting for her to put it in writing, celebrate it in public, and invite witnesses to watch exactly how far onto my land she had gone. Saturday morning came in bright and already hot, the kind of Texas heat that starts climbing before breakfast and laser shimmer over blacktop by 8 o'clock. I was at the fence line before the first golf cart rolled up from Willow Creek Estates. I had fresh batteries in both trail cameras, my phone fully charged, and a folder in my truck with every document Laura Bennett had told me to keep close. The pasture smelled like dry grass, pond water, and manure warming in the sun. Across that smell came the sweeter notes of fruit trays, store-bought pastries, and coffee from the folding tables Margaret had set up near the trailhead like she was opening a boutique park instead of celebrating a legal disaster. She had balloons tied to cedar posts. Balloons. White and green, bobbing over my fence wire in the morning breeze while children in little helmets gathered around with bicycles and parents held paper cups and smiled for pictures. Margaret wore another white outfit, this one with a fitted polo shirt embroidered with the neighborhood logo. She stood beneath a vinyl banner that said grand opening and held ceremonial scissors in one hand like she had personally discovered exercise. I stayed where I was unwatched. That was the hardest part. Not because I wanted to shout, but because I wanted to move too early. Laura had been clear. Let them confirm the use. Let them confirm the access. Let them confirm the knowledge. And Margaret, being Margaret, did all 3 with a microphone. She thanked the board for their vision, the residents for their patience, and the community partners who had helped transform underused land into a family resource. Underused land. I nearly laughed out loud. Then she said the sentence that made this whole thing worth waiting for. This new trail is now officially open for daily public enjoyment. I screenshot the live stream post before her sentence had even fully settled in the air. 10 minutes later my phone buzzed with a text from Laura. She had been watching from her office after I sent her the event link the night before. It said only 2 words. Enough now. I called the county livestock officer first because Laura wanted the agricultural safety issue documented before the HOA had time to rewrite the facts. Then she filed the emergency injunction from her side while I emailed over the final photos from the event. The speed of it all surprised even me. By a little after 10:30 a white county truck was pulling up beside the trailhead. Then another from the planning office. Margaret's smile held for maybe 30 seconds after she saw the uniforms. Long enough to convince herself this was still manageable. I watched that expression change in real time when the livestock officer stepped onto the path, looked at the mineral station, looked at the cattle lane, looked at the signs, and asked Margaret who had authorized public access through active grazing property. Her answer came out too smooth and too quick, like she had rehearsed confidence but not facts. The planning official had a paper packet in his hand, and I knew exactly what was inside because Laura had arranged delivery. Survey. Deed description. Agricultural valuation. Insurance exclusions. Fence photos. Timeline. Public event screenshots. They closed the trail on the spot pending review. No shouting. No drama. Just a bright orange notice zip-tied to Margaret's shiny new sign while parents quietly turned their bikes around and the pastry table wilted in the heat. By noon the HOA board members were standing in a tight circle under the banner, all forced smiles gone, while Margaret kept gesturing toward me like I had staged the laws of Texas just to embarrass her. But the best part was still coming. At 1:15 Laura called again and told me the association's insurance carrier had been notified of possible unauthorized public exposure on restricted livestock property. That landed like a thunderclap with no rain behind it. Suddenly this was no longer Margaret's cute little amenity project. It was liability. It was misrepresentation. It was property damage, trespass, and a paper trail too ugly for any insurer to ignore. By the time the last folding chair was loaded back into an SUV, the grand opening looked less like a celebration and more like the first day of an audit. They started tearing it out on a Wednesday just after sunrise. I know that because I was standing on the porch with a coffee mug in my hand when I heard the first metallic scrape of a skid steer bucket biting under the edge of that blacktop ribbon Margaret had been so proud of 5 days earlier. The sound carried across the pasture clear as church bells in cold air, sharp and ugly and honest in a way the grand opening never was. Asphalt does not sound triumphant when it comes apart. It sounds like something being corrected. By 7:30 the county notice was still zip-tied to the trail sign, but the banner was gone, the balloons were gone, and the cheerful little fantasy of community wellness had turned into a crew in orange vests loading broken chunks of pavement into dump trailers under a sky already heating up toward another 95-degree afternoon. The smell had changed too. No more fresh tar and fake ceremony. Now it was dust, diesel, torn grass, and the dark mineral smell of wet soil exposed where the base layer was being ripped up. My cattle had stayed off the south section while Laura handled the injunction and the insurance carrier started asking questions nobody on the HOA board wanted to answer. By then the story had spread beyond Willow Creek Estates. Not the polished version Margaret posted online. The real version. The one with survey lines, agricultural valuation, restricted insurance use, and a public trail illegally opened through active livestock land. Once the association's carrier got involved, everything accelerated. Laura pushed for damages tied to trespass, fence repair, pasture restoration, lost operational use, and legal fees. The county planning office made it clear that whatever conceptual exhibit Margaret had waved around was not approval, not dedication, and not authority to enter private agricultural property. The livestock officer filed his report. Dale documented the insurance exposure. And just like that, the confidence drained out of Margaret's little empire one board meeting at a time. I did not even have to raise my voice. That was the part one enjoyed most. Justice came in envelopes, emails, inspection forms, and one very expensive realization that asphalt poured in the wrong place does not become legal just because a homeowners association cuts a ribbon over it. A week after the removal started, Laura called me from Georgetown while I was repairing a gate hinge near the north lot. Her voice had that flat, satisfied tone she got when other people's paperwork had finally collapsed under its own weight. The HOA had agreed to a settlement. They would pay for full restoration of the pasture section, replacement of the cut fence, removal of all signage and trail materials, soil remediation where compaction interfered with grazing use, and compensation for the disruption to my operation. They were also required to issue a written acknowledgement that the land was private, active agricultural property and that no access right had ever been granted. I asked her to read that last sentence twice. Not because I had not heard it, but because some victories deserve an echo. Margaret resigned from the board 2 days later. Officially it was for personal reasons. That is always how people like her leave, wrapped in vague language and dignity they did not earn. But I heard enough through county channels and local gossip to know the truth. Residents were furious they had been invited onto land that was never safe or authorized for public use. The insurance carrier was reviewing the HOA's disclosures. The board had turned on itself. And Margaret, who once stood in my pasture talking about wasted visual space, had learned the hard way that land remembers exactly who it belongs to. By early fall the grass had started coming back over the scar. We reseeded the torn section, rebuilt the fence line with heavier corner bracing, and set new livestock warning signs on fresh cedar posts sunk deeper than the last ones. The first morning I moved the herd back through that south lane, the sun came up red over the trees and the cattle followed the old route like they had never doubted it for a second. Hooves pressed into dirt. Fence wire humming lightly in the breeze. Water trough catching gold light. Everything where it belonged again. I stood there with my hands hooked